In this podcast, I'm going to do the chronology of my investigation of Danny CASOLARO's evidence. He had investigated successfully the links of Nugan Bank with the secret team involved with Robert Booth Nichols, the loans affair that brought down the Gough Whitlam government in Australia, and also he was investigating the links of the Gambino Mafia with the Cabazon Casino at WACKENHUT Research Centre, where Michael Riconosciuto worked, and his business partner Paul Marascus had been murdered. Danny was also trying to investigate the link between the secret team, the Nugan Bank, and the Golden Triangle drugs. And what I'm going to do is show you that Danny CASOLARO had found the link of the secret team and the distribution of Golden Triangle drugs through the Nugan Bank in Australia being laundered through Nugan Bank and back to the Cabazon Casino with the Gambino Mafia, with their links with Dr. John P. Phillips from CIA and also Robert Booth Nichols. And I'll also show you the links across to Albert V. Carone, Colonel Albert V. Carone, as he was the bagman for the CIA for William Colby and William Casey and Ted Shackley's team to launder the drugs through the Nugan Bank and distribute the drugs for sale with the Gambino Mafia. So this is the story of my investigation into the evidence that Danny CASOLARO had when he decides to call Beau Gritz and Lance Trimmer. And this will be the chronology as a preface of, after finding the telephone numbers of Lance Trimmer, I decided to call him and ask him about his conversations with Danny CASOLARO, his murder, and more importantly, the evidence that Danny was exploring, which links to this investigation. So, for the story, it will cover the links of Lance Trimmer, up here, Beau Gritz, and linking across the Golden Triangle with the secret team, Ted Shackley, Richard Armitage with Michael Hand, and of course the links back to the Gambino Mafia with CIA through Albert V. Carone. When I went through Danny's notes, I found the telephone numbers of Lance Trimmer and Beau Gritz. I tried many times to call Beau Gritz, but unfortunately I couldn't get through. But I did finally break through and connect with Lance Trimmer. This is Danny CASOLARO's handwritten notes, and clearly he had all the telephone numbers for Lance Trimmer and was communicating with Lance quite extensively. As a preface to why I'm calling him, I'd like to give you some background on the evidence that I've uncovered right up between 2000 to 2016 before picking up the telephone and calling Lance Trimmer. In this podcast, I'm going to summarize for you that I've gone through the complete Zipperstein report, which was launched by the Attorney General, William Barr, to be able to investigate the concerns of Inslaw, that there was overwhelming evidence that Danny had been murdered, and that the conclusion of the Martinsburg police that he'd actually was depressed and had committed suicide is false, as there was very disturbing evidence. The disturbing evidence that I found in my journey of the research is that Stephen Zipperstein and Scott Erskine, who was appointed from FBI, from intelligence really in terrorism, and that in itself speaks for itself, what this is all about. But they never interviewed George Pittaway, given that his testimony given to the Martinsburg police confirmed that Danny and himself met a girlfriend of Ted Shackley at a party on the 4th of July, and she went back to Danny's house for drinks with them, and later that night Danny caught her secretly going through all his research files. The fact that the name Ted Shackley is in the official report of the Martinsburg Police and was never investigated is beyond belief. But more importantly, Stephen Zipperstein's team and Scott Erskine made a decision not to interview George Pittaway because I believe they knew where that would lead with the link with Ted Shackley. Second, Stephen Zipperstein never interviewed the last girlfriend of Danny CASOLARO. Danny had been dating a new girl for over 4 weeks, and she was intimately close to him, last person to be really close to him, and the Martinsburg Police were given her name and telephone number, which is recorded. And I've done a whole podcast on that in podcast number 1, where it's quite clear they know where that's leading. It leads to the Watergate Hotel, and that she was paid $10,000 to stay with the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Kuwait during the week that Danny is found dead. It's embarrassing, yes, but more importantly, Danny had the signed BCCI checks that were financed by the Kuwait royal family for the Iran-Contra scandal involving Ted Shackley and CIA, William Casey, director, and also Clint Murchison and Robert Gray. The next thing that Stephen Zipperstein failed to reveal was that Danny had those damaging evidence of the signed Iran-Contra BCCI checks signed by Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gorbanafar, which were put through the BCCI Monte Carlo accounts, including the memos of all the transfers and transactions. And he would have known that during his investigation that Senator Kerry's team investigating BCCI were investigating and pressuring the actor director of CIA about evidence and memos and internal documentation showing that CIA was involved with BCCI, and also would have been aware that Senator Kerry's legal team were demanding Robert Altman to provide copies of the legal evidence of those transactions involving Adnan Khashoggi, manager Gorbanafar, and the Monte Carlo accounts. He didn't provide it. And yet, Zipperstein team, Scott Erskine from FBI, would have known and would have seen that in Danny's folders of evidence that those checks exist and the bank accounts exist, which is the smoking gun of why all the directors of BCCI, including Robert Altman and Clark Clifford, were indicted, including one of the members of Kuwait Airlines and the royal family that financed those checks for CIA. The other thing that Stephen Zipperstein's final report, it also concludes that Danny CASOLARO was depressed and he just simply committed suicide. In fact, he went down to Martinsburg for the purposes of committing suicide. And this is all based upon the testimony of James Pittaway. He's a qualified psychotherapist, a friend of Danny, and also was one of the pallbearers for carrying Danny CASOLARO's coffin. So given that he's a psychotherapist and giving a professional opinion, that's what he bases his report on. What he fails to reveal is that the evidence was obvious that James Pittaway was a CIA asset involved in covert intelligence operations with CIA in Laos, Burma and Afghanistan, which involves the secret team. And this is an amazing journey that I'll take you through on why I was following these conclusions to pick up the phone to call Lance Trimmer. And its links back to WACKENHUT, Cabazon, and the casino with the Mafia, Gambino Mafia, and also directly links to the murder of Paul Maraska, who's money laundering Nugan Bank funds out of Australia which are the proceeds of the Golden Triangle drugs that have been flying into Australia and then shipped out to America, and also the illegal arms involving Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Ed Wilson to Africa, Korea, Indonesia, Middle East and Iran-Contra. What tricked me off was this. In The Last Circle by Cherie Seymour, I've interviewed her many times, but this is the section that I was particularly focused on. She puts in her book, Peter Zakosky allowed us to review a manuscript written by Robert Booth Nichols about the death of Danny CASOLARO. It was dated November 22nd, 1991. This is only a few months after Danny has died. It was entitled Danny CASOLARO's Octopus. Within the text of the manuscript, it was noted that Danny CASOLARO met Robert Booth Nichols at Jules Airport and asked him to meet with a man named George Pittaway and his brother Jim Pittaway at Cloud's Restaurant in McLean, Virginia. Jim Pittaway and George Pittaway both work closely with DIA, the Defence Intelligence Agency. These are the words of Robert Booth Nichols. They were currently with the Burmese Trade Council. Now this is very important because Danny had planned to go to Australia to investigate the Nugan Bank, the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, the Prime Minister of Australia, by the secret team, dirty tricks, and he was also going to go to Burma because he was investigating the link of the Golden Triangle drugs with Nugan Bank, and then he was going to return to the Cabazon, WACKENHUT research centres where Paul Marascus had been murdered, and he was going to also meet for dinner with Sam Cross, who was the Chief of Police, who investigated those murders and also multiple other murders linked to the Cabazon Casino and the WACKENHUT research centres where Michael Riconosciuto had modified the PROMIS software. At the restaurant, Robert Booth Nichols noted to George Pittaway that he had recently been asked to be the Cabinet Minister of Security Affairs for the opposition party in Dominica. Robert Booth Nichols said he had accepted the position with the approval of the Department of Justice. The manuscript went on to describe how Robert Booth Nichols had organised project financing for an oil drilling venture on the Karat Plateau of Thailand, which is linked across to the drugs with the secret team in the Golden Triangle. To support this, I was able to locate from Danny CASOLARO's folder a whole folder on Burma and drugs. I managed to find this in an official report which I located, which clearly shows that there was a media coverage on drug crisis, and in there is George Pittaway, Director, Burma Trade Council Inc., Alexandria, Virginia, which he owns with Jim Pittaway. I thought I would go a little bit further. I have discovered that George Pittaway and his brother owned a company called the Burmese Trade and were mysteriously visiting Burma regularly and involved with DIA and possibly CIA and the US State Department intelligence operations working with the Burmese resistant fighters. Jim Pittaway is a CIA agent and a licensed psychotherapist and a friend of General Richard G. Stilwell, former chief of CIA's Far East Division. Now that's very important because William Colby became that chief, and so did Ted Shackley. He's also a friend of the late Michael Aris, applies his professional expertise and his personal animosity to Aris' widow, Aung San Suu Kyi, to an analysis of Western policy towards Burma. And you're going to find that Jim Pittaway is intimately involved in the covert operations of CIA going back to the Vietnam War and all of the dealings of CIA in Laos, Thailand, Burma, and then proceeds to go on to Afghanistan. Danny CASOLARO's notes below clearly confirmed that he had discovered the links of Oliver North and George Pittaway and Greg Shade with the CIA and DIA links with arms and drugs trade in Burma and Afghanistan. It was Danny CASOLARO who introduced George Pittaway to Ben Mason. Ben Mason, who I've interviewed extensively, one of the most trusted, loyal friends to Danny, has been helping me for years to see if we can reopen the investigation into the death of Danny CASOLARO. And Ben confirmed that George Pittaway and Jim Pittaway were DIA and very possibly CIA, with CIA contacts and State Department contacts, and working and collecting intelligence in Burma for the US government under the guise of foreign aid. They did not like to talk to Ben Mason about those activities, but certainly hinted about them several times. So based on that information, I used my research skills to uncover that there was also a third brother, Peter Pittaway, and he was also working with DIA or CIA, and most likely CIA. And this is what I uncovered. This is a copy of the handwritten notes of Detective George Schwartzwood. Handwritten notes of his. And it clearly says that Danny and George Pittaway met Ted Shackley's girlfriend on July 4th, and they took her home and found her looking through Danny's things. Then Jim Ridgway, who's the journalist it was covering, and revealed all the details about Danny's new girlfriend. So he's even aware that Danny has a new girlfriend and has her name and number. Who wrote the article for Village Voice, spoke to Danny's last girlfriend. And I've interviewed Jim Ridgway and covered in my previous podcast, is that he helped me track down what she looked like, where I could find her last, and it took me years, but I tracked her down to get her testimony, which I have recorded, and confirming very disturbing details. And says that she works in Herndon, at a restaurant in Herndon as a waiter. Her name is Wendy, but it's not Wendy Weaver. It's quite specific, and when you go through the Martinsburg police reports, they even have found her number and her full name, and it's Wendy Golden with her telephone number. So this is where it starts to get obvious that there was never an intention to investigate the overwhelming evidence that Danny CASOLARO was being threatened, his life was being threatened, that he had the most damaging evidence against CIA and particularly Ted Shackley's secret team and the directors and founders of BCCI, and was investigating damaging evidence that they'd also been involved in the theft of Inslaw software and laundering drugs and arms through Nugan Hand Bank and BCCI. Given that this is all in the official Martinsburg police notes and investigations, Zipperstein and Erstein, FBI agent, were responsible to interview all of those people and recover any evidence that would hint that Danny was in danger, that threats had been made against him, and that they were going to do an independent investigation to come to a conclusion whether or not Danny had been murdered or whether he was simply depressed and went down to Martinsburg to commit suicide. So let me show you the disturbing evidence. Danny CASOLARO's notebooks clearly had also the name of Peter Pittaway and his telephone number. He was one of the brothers. When I did my research and through social media, I found this picture of him with weapons in Burma, meeting with the Quran resistance fighters. And if you look at the back there, you'll see that there are boxes that are upside down, clearly marked with USA. And on the table there are all the weapons that he's inspecting. Now, I don't know if he's delivered those from the USA or whether or not he's inspecting their cache, but he's clearly in some capacity with intelligence with the Burmese resistance with arms. I also found through social media, here's a picture of him at a White House function. I don't know how you get invited to a White House function, but here he is with Bono from the U2 band. And I love U2, but the fact is he's invited to be at this function at White House. So we have preliminary evidence that raises serious questions about what Zipperstein didn't investigate. So let's have a look at what he did investigate and what processes did they go to. Now, the reason why this is very important is William Hamilton's attorneys clearly stated back to the Zipperstein and Department of Justice team that they were very disturbed about the way that Scott Erskine was doing his investigations and putting words in his mouth and witnesses' mouths to write it in a way that it was actually reverse of what they were saying. Also, they had questions really seriously about the fact that their contacts within intelligence were nervous about coming forward because they didn't trust Stephen Zipperstein to be independent of the Department of Justice, which had allegedly stolen, Bill Hamilton's PROMIS software and had given it to Israeli intelligence of Rafi Eitan. And hence I've put next to it that he's an author on law and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And also, when I look at his resume, it's even more disturbing of where he's gone, given what I know about the PROMIS software. So, two things are that it wasn't seen to be an independent investigation. It was the Department of Justice investigating itself. It's implicated in the theft and distribution of Inslaw's software to Peter Wiedniks to Earl Bryan to deliver to WACKENHUT for Michael Riconosciuto to modify and then given back to CIA and NSA to be used in their intelligence operations in breach of copyright. Let's have a look at the evidence and the conclusions. Now look at the conclusion. They found no evidence that Danny was threatened or in danger or any other evidence that was damaging within his research. In fact, it was totally invalid and he was living in fantasy world. And it was agreed that the evidence was overwhelming from his friends. Don't you like this? From his friends. James Pittaway. That he professionally assessed that Danny was depressed and simply went to Martinsburg to commit suicide. So let's have a look at this. So here's the official report. I've got all the handwritten notes, copies of those, and I've been through them all. And this part I'm only going to concentrate on the investigations that involve the Pittaway brothers, George Pittaway, James Pittaway, Lillian Pittaway, the wife of James Pittaway, and Peter Pittaway. And who wasn't interviewed, and who was, and what did they say, and what basis did that have on influencing the report. So let's have a look at it. So first of all, here's a very good article because Danny actually met with Jeffrey Steinberg from the LaRouche Foundation. In fact, Jeffrey Steinberg had provided him with a confidential report called the Indochina Report, which was overwhelming evidence of US customs officials that had identified that Earl Bryan, Peter Wiedniks and Mossad agents were involved with the Gambino Mafia selling arms illegally worldwide and also bringing in containers of heroin from Kuwait to New York with the Gambino Mafia. So that's an incredible bit of evidence there, which I'll cover as a separate podcast, but he raised serious concerns about the independence of Department of Justice investigating itself and the dirty tricks that are involved in undermining any investigation relating to Danny CASOLARO and the theft of Inslaw's PROMIS software, and particularly them investigating the death of Danny CASOLARO. And quite clearly it shows here that Attorney General Janet Reno had decided that the DOJ probe of Insular affair ordered by Bush attorney. So you've got George Bush's own attorney, General William Barr, had rejected. And so they've set up an independent counsel probe into Inslaw, and the DOJ's report has been widely criticised as a blatant cover-up. And I'm going to show you that it was a cover-up, definitively and deliberately, and at the cost of Danny Casolaro's family ever having justice, or more importantly, Danny Casolaro receiving justice, given that he had the smoking gun of the BCCI Iran-Contra scandal. So let's have a look at this while he's investigating the links of the Golden Triangle drugs with the secret team. He appointed FBI investigator Scott Erskine from the Anti-Terrorist Division, and also Assistant US Attorney Stephen E. Zipperstein. So I'll refer to this as the Zipperstein report. And it says here that they've interviewed several of Casolaro's friends about their discussions with him just before his death. This was the first time the federal investigators attempted to gather such information about the Casolaro case. And at the time of his death, Casolaro was working full-time on a book about Inslaw's scandal. He told friends that he had unearthed explosive documentation of the links between the theft of the PROMIS software and illegal US intelligence operations, and that his trip to West Virginia would really nail it down. So it's quite clear there that it's reconfirming that Danny doesn't jump on a plane to commit suicide. It turns out that no, he had spent an hour and a half with Thomas Gate, FBI agent, about all the evidence relating to Robert Burt Nichols, links with the Gambino Mafia, involvement with WACKENHUT, and also selling arms and links with drugs and mafia, and even the cocaine groups in South America, and also back to the Golden Triangle. He also spent another hour, after speaking to Thomas Gates, with Richard Stavin, former US attorney, who was uncovering the corruption within the Department of Justice of officials not only assisting the drug cartels to undermine their investigations, but also the evidence that was building up about the links between the Mafia and MCA investigations at the time involving Robert Booth Nichols. So let's move forward. This is a summary of the Zipperstein report with all their investigations, and it's listed all many people in there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the ones just for this part relating to the Pittaway brothers. They've interviewed Lillian Pittaway, the wife of James Pittaway, including himself. There's no George Pittaway, who provided his testimony about the girlfriend of Ted Shackley going home to Danny's house and caught secretly going through all his research files. He's not interviewed. It turns out he's a closer friend to Danny than James was. Also, Peter Pittaway is not there as well. Okay, so up the top there, he's interviewing Thomas Gates, interviewing Richard Stavin, and also interviewing William and Nancy Hamilton. My first part that I'm doing now is going to focus on the Pittaways, the brothers. And the only two I can look at for his investigation is that he's only selected James Pittaway, Lillian Pittaway, and totally dismissed the testimony given of George Pittaway involving Ted Shackley and his girlfriend. So let's go across. On the right there you can see that they're also speaking to Central Intelligence Agencies. They're also looking at Casolaro's evidence received from. Everything here is blanked out. Doesn't identify who they're talking to. And also evidence that's been examined by the FBI laboratory. Also, Behavioural Science Unit, FBI Academy, report dated March 31st, 1994, United States Attorney offices, and it's got the Kentucky, Virginia, Washington and Tennessee. Isn't it interesting that they're looking at behavioural science, psychological profiling? Is it psychological profiling on the offender, or is it psychological profiling in advance on Danny CASOLARO? Well, let's see. What independence and credibility does this report have? So now let's have a look. Here's the handwriting. Jim Pettaway, and interviewing Jim about what's happened. And this is what they've typed up from their interview. Handwritten, but this is what they've written. In attempt to contact Lillian Pettaway, Jim Pettaway was interviewed. Pettaway advised that he has known CASOLARO since 1987, having met CASOLARO through his marriage to Lillian, and knew CASOLARO so well that he was one of CASOLARO's pallbearers at the funeral. So what we're going to be reading now is his testimony about Danny as his best friend. At the outset of the conversation, Pettaway indicated that it was his strong opinion that CASOLARO had become involved in a conspiracy game, that he had been sucked into it, and that he had spent a lot of time dealing with and talking to pathological liars. He continued that over the year prior to CASOLARO's death, he became more driven and obsessive with these people, and noted that in February and March 1991, CASOLARO seemed to sink into fantasy land, which got worse as the year progressed. That's a really helpful introduction from your best friend. But let's go further. What does James Pettaway continue to say? He says, Pettaway advised, this is advising Scott Erskine, that many of the people that CASOLARO was dealing with were so involved in the conspiracy game theory that they were making their careers out of dealing with it. Pettaway further advised that he was aware that financially CASOLARO had encountered many problems. So let's do the first hook. We're feeding in information that is disillusioned, losing contact with reality, conspiracy. Now he's got serious financial problems, that he was losing touch with reality, and that was dealing with some perhaps very dangerous people. Well, if he's dealing with dangerous people, I would have thought that it's a chance that he was getting threats for investigating these matters. He advised that he last spoke with CASOLARO on either Monday or Tuesday before CASOLARO left, that he knew CASOLARO was going to West Virginia to meet with someone, but did not know that person's identity. So, okay, he's confirming that he's not going down to commit suicide. He's going down to meet somebody. He further advised that he smelled a rat with the people CASOLARO was talking to, and advised that he saw a definite change in CASOLARO's personality, even though CASOLARO remained the same on the outside. Is this his expertise in psychotherapy as an expert witness for FBI investigator? It sounds like it. Pettaway explained that CASOLARO had lost touch with reality when he started to receive threatening phone calls and telling people that he'd received these threatening phone calls. He, Pettaway, strongly suggested they contact AT&T or the phone company in order to trace the phone calls. Instead of following through on this keyword logical idea, CASOLARO changed the subject, indicating that he did not want to engage in this constructive solution to this particular problem. It's very clever. It's planting the seeds that he is not logical. Fantasy world. He strongly felt, this is the words, he strongly felt that CASOLARO became less connected with the real life and more engaged in weird stuff and living in a fantasy world, that he was losing grip and becoming quite depressed. Now that's very important. He's now using depression. he has the symptoms of depression. Pittaway further advised he felt that CASOLARO did in fact, wait for it, commit suicide, and had shrouded his death in mystery in order to continue his conspiracy theories. That is the most damning, undermining testimony that any friend could give to their best friend. Given that Danny CASOLARO is found with both wrists slashed, and given what we know, he had the smoking gun. That would have changed history with the BCCI investigations had that been given by the Zipper-Scenes team, the checks, the signed checks and the memos, urgently sought by Senator Kerry's committee. Zipper-Stein's team, including FBI agent Erskine, had full access to all of Danny's files where I found those checks and memos. This is in 1993. This is an important time that basically they've been investigating this for quite a while, but the fact is those files have been accessible to the Martinsburg Police and Department of Justice and FBI since 1991, August 1991. And I found them from Australia. So let's go further. Then they decide to interview Lillian Pittaway. That's the wife of James Pittaway. And she confirms and advises that she's known CASOLARO for approximately 10 years and at one time was very close to him. However, after she met her husband, her contact with CASOLARO lessened. That's interesting. She stated that she knew he was going to West Virginia, but because she was not personally interested in his work, never knew any of the details in regard to what he was dealing with, but knew that he was getting much too involved with very bad people. Now, how can you dismiss that Danny CASOLARO is not receiving threats and is in danger when they're admitting, both of them, that he's mixing with very bad people? She indicated, however, that during her last conversation with CASOLARO on August 1st, 1991, and Danny dies on the 10th, CASOLARO indicated to her that he was going to meet with a person who's going to give him the biggest tip. So there you go. He didn't go down to commit suicide. He was on his way to meet with a source that was going to give him his evidence of the head of the octopus. All right, so let's see what Zipperstein does with the rest of it. Now, this has all been typed up by Scott Erskine. And I'll show you how Scott Erskine writes draft reports and interviews people and manipulates the evidence so that the conclusions are based on what they would like rather than on the facts and the evidence. Pittaway continued that she agrees with her husband that CASOLARO more than likely committed suicide, that she felt he was self-destructive and that he was becoming obsessed with his octopus conspiracy stuff, and that his definite abuse of alcohol. Now, don't you like this? She's introducing that definite abuse of alcohol affected his reasoning up to the end. She stated that CASOLARO was a troubled person. In the end, that he was not happy, and further believed that other friends and even his brother, Dr. Tony CASOLARO, were coming to the opinion that perhaps he did commit suicide because of the change in his personality. Well, your best friends are willingly providing the worst evidence that you could ever give that helps the FBI and the Department of Justice not investigate anything to do with the evidence that Danny had in his folders, the witnesses that are coming forward and the credible witnesses that believe he was murdered. And not only that, he's got financial difficulties, he's got the symptoms of depression, and he went down to Martinsburg to commit suicide, yet he was going down to meet a key source. So let's have a look at what FBI agent Scott Erskine, decided to draft. And this is what he had scribbled out. On the section of drinking problems, he wrote originally, Casolaro's friends all acknowledged that he was a social drinker, which according to Wendy Weaver meant would get drunk only 2 or 3 times a week. And I've interviewed Wendy Weaver and she never said that. Although some of his friends, such as Wendy Weaver and Lillian Pittaway, so he's putting words into Wendy Weaver's mouth based on what Lillian Pittaway has said. Notice that he seemed to be drinking more heavily. However, Casolaro's family and friends to this day insist, almost uniformly, that he was not a heavy drinker and that he certainly was not an alcoholic. Given the contradictory nature of what he's writing, it's quite clear that Zipperstein or someone else decided that that's not going to be helpful for our final report, let's just leave it out. And so they crossed it out. Don't you love it that when you look through the evidence that they've built it into this case that he's a drunk and an alcoholic, but then it's contradicted by the fact of his family, his closest family and his closest friends say that he's not a heavy drinker and he's certainly not an alcoholic, which is what they're trying to perceive him as. So all they're left with is, let's go back to James Pittaway's testimony, the pallbearer for his coffin, so-called best friend, is going to say that he's had the symptoms of depression and firmly believes and strongly believes that he committed suicide. Let's see how that propagates. It's typical CIA psychological warfare and misinformation to paint the story that we want you to have. And it looks like that Scott Erskine has been willingly looking for evidence that would substantiate that. And I'll show you in these podcasts, first part focusing on the Pittaway, second part will focus on the other real high credible people that Danny's spending an hour and a half with and an hour before going down, what he does to discredit them and other credible witnesses. So you then have to ask yourself, what is the motive of someone being appointed who's linked to intelligence in anti-terrorism, and I'll say that again, not murder, anti-terrorism, the task force for terrorism within FBI intelligence, to be painting a picture, to manipulate statements, to paint the picture that Danny Casolaro was financially broke, depressed and went down to commit suicide, and totally discount anything else. Well, let's look at this. I found this in my research. It's dated 1980, 11 years before Danny Casolaro is killed. And it is the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. And it's a convention in Virginia. And look at this. Who's in attendance? Oh, we've got Frank Colucci, Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. Given that he had organised with the secret team the $4 billion loans affair to bring down the Gough Whitlam, Prime Minister of Gough Whitlam, Australian government, with the Federal Treasurer in Australia, with Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, Michael Hand. A very interesting character to be there. Of course, Dr. Ray Klein. It's dated October 1980. Let's continue and see who else turns up. Of course, other affiliate members attending is Ray Klein's and William Colby. William Colby's attending. Let's keep going. Now remember, he's been the legal counsel to Nugan Bank. That is laundering the drugs from the Golden Triangle with the secret team, with all the parties involved, with Ted Shackley. And surprise, surprise, we've got James W. Pittaway, our wonderful friend of Danny Casolaro, carrying his coffin out and giving testimony as a professional psychotherapist that he's a professional opinion is that Danny had financial difficulties, disillusioned, living in fantasy world, had all the symptoms of depression, and strongly believes that Danny has committed suicide, and he becomes the key source of evidence for the Zipperstein report. Let's keep going. Given that he's a trained psychotherapist, I interviewed Ben Mason. I didn't know anything about Lillian Pittaway, but he told me, "Did you know that years later she committed suicide?" I said, "No, I didn't know that." That's quite staggering. And I found her obituary. Her maiden name was Black. She certainly was the wife of James Pittaway, giving the testimony that she believed that Danny committed suicide. And given that James Pittaway has the expertise on profiling and strongly believing that Danny was depressed and committed suicide, we find that his own wife sadly commits suicide years later. So the evidence that Zipperstein has based it on has serious questions of credibility and independence. I then did a search and found, yes, she was married and related to James W. Pittaway and the Pittaway family, and of course have a stepdaughter, Leela Pittaway. Mary Pittaway is a relation, but I noticed this, that she's related to the Stillwell family. Keep that in the back of your mind. The Stillwell family are related in some way. And then I found this. Who really is James Pittaway, the psychotherapist? And it turns out that he's a freelance writer, and he's lived extensively in Afghanistan for the last 15 years and spent more months in Pakistan. But I found this article. He's a writer for the American Conservative magazine. This is in 2003. But I found this. It says, "I was there for 2 reasons." He's talking about Afghanistan. To see if I could come up with something for the Washington Post and to assess the capabilities and aims of the Afghan fundamentalist troops for my friend, General Richard G. Stillwell at Pentagon. Stillwell got his report, and I got a piece in the Post titled, "The Afghan War is Over When the Afghans Say So." Don't you like that? That our best friend of Danny CASOLARO works for the CIA on intelligence, and he's in Afghanistan doing intelligence for General G. Stillwell. Now, why is that name General Richard G. Stillwell important? One, he was the chief of the Far East CIA division. And then you have William Colby, who's the legal counsel for the Nugan Bank. He was the chief of the CIA Far East. And we also had Ted Shackley was appointed as the head of the Far East division. So you have a direct link between all these people back to Jim Pittaway, who worked for the CIA. Let's go further. Here's confirmation who is General Stillwell, Richard G. Stillwell. And, of course, he died in 1991, only a few months after Danny dies. And he ran a company called Stillwell Associates. In 1981, he was named the Deputy Under-Secretary of Defence for International Security Policy, and this part's very important. I will prepare you. It is his team that financed Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer for their mission to rescue POWs and MIAs in Burma, to investigate and Laos, in terms of also the meeting that they had with the drug lord. And Danny's reaching out to Lance Trimmer and Beau Gritz because he's finding links between the secret team, the Golden Triangle, drugs, and the Nugan Bank back to the Cabazon casino and the murder of Paul Maraska, who's laundering the funds for the Nugan Bank. When William Casey, as you know, was the General Counsel to the WACKENHUT, and William Colby was the General Counsel to Nugan Bank. So let's continue on. He's also the expert on Burma. Thought that was interesting. And there it is. He knows the husband. He knows the husband of Aung San Suu Kyi and has worked extensively on intelligence matters in Laos and lived in Laos, and also closely linked with the support and training and operations of intelligence with the resistance fighters in Burma. Then I found this article dated 1989, 2 years before Danny has died, and Danny found this because I found that he had written down the name of Greg Shade, is a friend of George Pittaway and the best buddy with Oliver North. And this is the article confirming that Greg Shade and George Pittaway, two political activists who were visiting border camps helping administer medicine, don't you like the humanitarian aid in the guise of intelligence, documenting atrocities against students, and of course linked with the Burmese resistance. So the evidence is that Greg Shade is the best buddy of Oliver North and is working closely with George Pittaway. So let's keep going. We're now looking at the overwhelming evidence that to come to a conclusion that Danny CASOLARO was depressed and committed was all based on a written interview and testimony and professional profile provided by James Pittaway, who is a CIA agent/asset and has been working in the Golden Triangle and is linked to General Richard G. Stilwell and the secret team. So let's go one thing further. Then I thought, let's have a look at what else. Now, Danny had a folder called Burma, Drugs, Golden Triangle. And I went through and he had a copy of all these confidential reports. And I found this is a letter written by George Pittaway to Joan Vale, who's working in the Office of the President in July 1990 for George Bush Sr. and the Office of the National Drug Control Policy, White House. This is his letter direct to her, providing intelligence on narcotics and oil opportunities in Burma linked to the rebels and the Burmese army, and very detailed, and pushing for the efforts of intelligence for promoting democracy. Now that's got all the rings of John Singlaub with his NED opportunity and WACKEL organisations, which I will touch on, have always been used as foundations that are tax deductible to raise funds for the Iran-Contras to move and sell drugs and arms worldwide. He goes through here and is giving International Narcotic Control Organisation called INCOS, and he's also saying that DEA will continue to operate intelligence suppression and the interdiction program. Now, my previous podcasts have clearly confirmed that the secret team had infiltrated all of the intelligence databases. They developed the software and installed the computer systems for the drug interdiction program across all agencies, with Earl Bryan's companies, with Ted Shackley's companies, with their programmers. He then goes on and talks about that he's working with the Committee for Restoration of Democracy, and he's setting up foundations for democracy in Burma. Signed by George Pittaway. I then found that they were also involved with the Foundation for Democracy in Burma, set up in Virginia as a tax deduction accredited foundation with all these board members, academics, and I continue to go through it. And of course, its mission in life is to provide humanitarian aid. Exactly what Oliver North, John Singlaub, Ted Shackley, and Richard Secord were doing with all their foundations to raise funds for Iran-Contra and for uprisings of resistance fighters to provide arms and sell drugs. And this one here is an interesting one. He goes on to say that Colonel Robert Halvey with Defence Intelligence College, and they're needing support for a satellite ground receiving station for monitoring Thai military activities and communications. So here is the real intelligence on the ground in the front of humanitarian aid. And also he provides, this is George Pittaway providing back the intelligence that they're detecting and following Fritz Werner's German arms deals involving the Chinese to Burma, and talking about here that we're looking at 40 tanks courtesy of China. So we are talking about a bit of an arms race going on with arms dealers, and he's providing all the intelligence back on that. He just says, I've received intelligence, and this is the director of the Committee for Restoration of Democracy in Burma. Don't you love it? And telling him that George received the following information. This is George Pittaway. He's learnt from George from a reliable source near the Burma-China border this morning, and was asked for his opinions on the veracity of the intelligence and analysis as to what to do about it. It then goes on that the People's Republic of China has delivered ammunition, including radar equipment. Also, MT submarine missiles to Burma. China's ship had unloaded 2 consecutive days. They're looking at delivery of jet fighters, 4 naval patrol boats, F-6 and F-7, they were jet fighters, and also it's called the Hainan or Shanghai class naval patrol boats, worth $1 billion US. So clearly his role is not really foundation and aid, it's about undercover intelligence. As I said, Cherie Seymour said that she witnessed a transaction, a transcript written by Robert Boot Nichols confirming that George Pittaway and James Pittaway worked for DIA. And I'm going to reveal that it's not just DIA, but it's also CIA, particularly for James Pittaway. So, this is the interesting part. The foundation, who are the board of directors? Mr. Thao Ang Kin and Mr. Bo K9. These are the two I'll focus on. And of course, they're going back and being educated in the US and Virginia, and then they're being resent out to set up these foundations in Burma. And have a look at this. Who is Yu Thao Ang Quinn? Well, he was the Burma expert that worked for the US Office of World Information Psychological Warfare Team, attached to General Stilwell's headquarters in China, Burma-India War Theatre. Now that's back in 1943 and 1945, and that's under Joseph Stilwell. Next, he was the chief editor in 66 to 84 in Washington for the Burma Services. And now he's the president of the Foundation for Democracy of Burma. So this is the fingerprints of intelligence all over it, going back into the Golden Triangle, back to the Second World War. But General Richard Stilwell is the key. James Pittaway personally knows him and was providing intelligence to him. And this is the link that's going to be crucial for why I picked up the phone to call Lance Trimmer with disturbing evidence that Danny CASOLARO had been talking with them, but more importantly, I had uncovered the link with the Pittaway brothers that was very disturbing in terms of the cover-up and the death of Danny CASOLARO by the US Department of Justice investigators and FBI agent Scott Erskine, and the tactics he used to manipulate statements provided by witnesses that was incorrect and exaggerated but selective with people who are providing the statements that he needs to say that he was depressed, Danny CASOLARO was depressed and simply committed suicide. The source for that information is highly suspect cover-up of CIA involvement in the whole operations that Danny CASOLARO was exposing. So let's go a bit further. Here's further correspondence and resume for Bo Nain, and now they're sending in computer expertise, okay? And of course it says mini project with the army, and he's going in to set up the Burma Foundation for Democracy. And as you can see, another one, lots of computer expertise in these areas. So it's setting up the computer technologies, the software, surveillance and radar communication systems, and it's all to do with psychological profiling, warfare and aid to rebels for uprisings with arms and perhaps drugs. So let's have a look at what else. I then found this report, an authoritative report about Laos, and it's based on the fact that it's written by James Pittaway, who works for CIA. And it's his intelligence report of when he lived in Laos and how the drugs and opium really works. Isn't that helpful for the secret team? And after 16 years of his father, okay, his dad was transferred to Bangkok. And after 16 years of drab and identical Air Force bases located in some of the most boring, desolate places in the US and Thailand. And talks about that we lived there, we had a garden. Even my father's jobs were not boring. This is interesting. He had been assigned to the Pentagon's Advanced Research Project Agency, and his colleagues were there at the behest of Mr. McNamara. Robert McNamara heads up the CIA IRIS, Swift banking software based on the CIA SAFE software that was developed by Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley and Earl Bryan's team for the fusion of all intelligent databases for CIA, NSA, DIA, and was put into all the banks worldwide. So he's back there, and Bundy brothers, who discovered a brand new phenomenon which they called brushfire war. I haven't heard of this. They were there to figure out how this kind of war could be fought. Not only were there officers from every branch of the services and other government agencies, but also academics, diplomats, scientists, corporate officers, foundation people who worked in APRA Brain Trust. There was also a substantial international contingent of officers from NATO, SEATO and ANZUS. Okay? The British, having contained an insurgency in the neighbouring Malaya, were particularly full of wisdom and came up with important contributions like strategic hamlets, search and destroy. Everyone agreed that the Chinese were a menace and that the Vietnamese communists had to be stopped. So we can see his background. It never occurred to anyone that this might get burned in this bushfire war. And he goes on and talks about the Vietnamese, the Phalangs, and there was also welcome respect for the Thais might have. And it says here these were very Phalangs who whipped Hitler and even Tojo and liked them. The Thais believed they would make short of this Ho Chi Minh character. So he's going back to the fight on communism during the Vietnam War. And so he goes through and talks about his experiences of living in Laos during the Vietnam War. And of course he's a teacher, teaching English, and then he confirms the following. The Hmong Hill tribes were divided into two coalitions. One was Pride and Joy of the CIA. Don't you love that? And the other allied uneasily with Patha Lao. There was independent chieftains, opium warlords, and other fighting units, and who came into the area with Vinegar Joe Stilwell in 44. So his links back to the Stilwell family seem to be strong. Having thus set the pitch, the powers mounted and Spook Olympiad and the prohibition on overt intervention to intervene one way or another. So he's talking about the covert operations of CIA, KGB, French and everyone in these areas, including the East Germans, the Czechs, the North and South Koreans, the Israelis, the Australians, the Pakistanis. He's right in the middle. He said it was a contest, involved spies, commandos, infantry, artillery and air power. Remember, he's the author of this report, his expertise on Laos. So if you have a secret war in Laos and if you've got POWs left behind and MIAs, then you actually have someone on the ground with intimate knowledge working within the CIA that would know what's going on, and particularly when we get to the drugs. He says the school where I taught, he goes through, he was teaching a neutralist wing of the Laos royal family. These are the students that he's teaching. So he's getting to know many people who then went on to become Laotian army and police officers. The military situation was essentially this. In the spring of 71, the South Vietnamese with US commandos and massive air support had attempted to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in eastern Laos. You can see there is their intelligence man on the ground teaching English at a local school, which is always good for CIA agents and foundations providing humanitarian aid. So he's intimately involved in Laos. This part is very important, particularly that he then goes on that he says, I met a woman named Phet, and she was the queen. She was connected with the Chinese underworld and was part of the police informer. She was a fixer and a procurer and the interface between the outside world. She also ran the opium den. Though her prestige was low, because she was indispensable and so inclined, her power was absolute. She was a stunning female analogue. So basically, we have an informer, and given that she's an informer, she's allowed to run an opium den. And so confirms that after getting to know her, there were shadowy figures at the periphery of her opium den. And then he goes on and talks about how the opium is being used, being dissolved for old women and injected for the young men. Particularly the tribal peasants are the ones that are providing the opium. So he's intimately involved with the knowledge of the drug lords and the processes for opium while he's working in Laos. And then he's also got another document that he has actually authored, which is detailing the background on the female freedom fighters. And so more of the same. His information is full reports on the links of CIA and the roles of the Burmese villages and the transport of opium products out of the region, and the Rangoon, which still gets substantive military support from the United States. I think this is overwhelming evidence. He reconfirms the request. We will ask Washington only for such highly specialised and technical assistance as satellite output and dash dash dash. Obviously, undercover, Burma will not ask the Congress of the United States for one dime. There will be no request for assistance from the DEA or any other government agency. So we really have Jim and George Pittaway intimately involved in intelligence with DEA, DIA and CIA in Burma and Laos. But what's important, it's all relating to the intelligence of the Golden Triangle and the War on Drugs program, which President Bush or Vice President Bush was running, and given that the secret team has infiltrated all of the intelligence databases that controls the interdiction, then you know how to distribute it back in without being detected. So in these areas here, it's quite clear that they're intimately involved in all intelligence matters on the ground in Burma and Laos during the war in Vietnam. And during Danny Casolaro's time, they're now predominantly in Burma. So I'll skip through this. It's basically more of the same, but this is interesting. I'm wanting to contact Lance Trimmer and Bo Gritz because Danny had contacted Lance Trimmer and Bo Gritz because he was following the evidence of Ted Shackley, Richard Armitage involved with the Golden Triangle's drug supplies with the Gambino Mafia into New York and Australia and laundering it through the Nugan Hand Bank. And even writes here that Nellis even met with Kunsar himself and heard him make the offer of a 5-year buyout plan. Nellis believed this is genuine enough at least to consider, especially since there were plenty of potential sticks to go along with the carrot of economic composition demanded by the warlord. The biggest stick was another offer, this one from General Bayer, head of the Karen ethnic resistance in Burma. This is very important, and a fundamental Christian whose antipathy to opium cultivation was well known and well documented. It says here General Meyer appealed for a green light from Washington and minimal US assistance to enable him, the Karen, to apply military pressure to hold Kunsar's feet to the fire and, if necessary, force him out of business. Well, isn't it interesting that James Pittaway and George Pittaway are intimately involved in matters relating to the secret team, their links with intelligence of all agencies, and they're intimately involved in matters in Burma when Danny Casolaro is showing interest in the evidence that had been uncovered by Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer and his investigations of the Golden Triangle drugs being laundered through the Nugan Hand Bank and linking back to Paul Maraska, who was murdered at Cabazon Casino, who was laundering the drugs for Nugan Hand Bank and with the Gambinos, who owned Cabazon Casino with John P. Nichols. All right, down the side there, it looks like it's Danny's notes. CIA, Air America. He's starting to pick up all the links in here. I thought I'd just highlight many of them. He's talking about Kunsar and CIA, Air America. I think Danny can see the links, and I think this is what evidence he was having in terms of, and it's got down the bottom here, that but Nellis had not reckoned on the consummate moralism of the Carter administration incarnate in this case, in the chief of White House narcotics advisor, the pot-smoking Dr. Peter Bourne. Bourne killed the Nellis plan stone cold dead, and the notorious doctor rejected any collaboration with the notorious Bo Meyer on the grounds that he lacked any international standing or recognition. So you can see that this is all happening right through the 70s and 80s, and now they're still there in the 90s when Danny Casolaro's homing in on evidence of linking the secret team, Nugan Bank, back to the death of Paul Maraska, and working with Michael Riconosciuto at the WACKENHUT Research Centre and the Cabazon Arms and Casino involved in supplying drugs and arms laundered through Nugan Bank, BCCI, with Richard C. Gord, Albert Hakim, Ted Shackley, and the supply and training of weapons for Iran-Contra. So I won't spend much more time on that, but clearly you have quite an interesting group there. And as I said, it says here that the chair of the Committee for Restoration of Democracy in Burma is stating quite categorically in his correspondence back to the US government, my colleague George Pittaway, in sending regards. So his role is intimately involved in intelligence. Now, why I bring this up to you, he's given a testimony to the Martinsburg police that he met the girlfriend of Ted Shackley at a party on the 4th of July. And then they went back with her to Danny's house for drinks after the party, and Danny caught her secretly going through all his research files. Why wasn't he interviewed about the link with Ted Shackley's girlfriend being in the house of Danny Casolaro and caught going through his files? 2, I've also reached out probably 10 times to call, and he refuses to answer my call in my endeavours to try and help reopen the investigation into the death of Danny Casolaro, given all the evidence that I've uncovered in my previous podcasts. I also rang multiple times to Jim Pittaway, and he also declined to speak. The only person that has helped me is Trey Casolaro, the son of Danny, Wendy Weaver, who believes that Danny was murdered and had received telephone calls regularly from Richard C. Cord to Danny's house. She even answered them when he calls. And also Ben Mason, his best friend, who truly believes that Danny was murdered, given that he cited those BCCI checks and transactions of the Monte Carlo bank accounts that were never put forward by Martinsburg Police or the Zipperstein US Department of Justice attorneys and the FBI investigator and agent Scott Erskine had never forwarded those to the investigations into BCCI, given that it was quite clear that the crisis on the front pages was that Senator Kerry was having difficulty in getting any documents or relevant testimonies from the acting head of CIA, confirming that there is bank accounts and transactions with BCCI that involve CIA agents, and the fact that Robert Altman had declined and refused to provide copies of those checks and transactions of the accounts of Monte Carlo involving BCCI and Adnan Khashoggi and Gorban Afar, which was the smoking gun that Danny had in his briefcase when he went down to meet his key source in Martinsburg and was found dead with both arms, wrists slashed multiple times, which is beyond belief that he committed suicide. So I'll skip through the rest here. It's overwhelming of the links that George Pittaway and James Pittaway and Peter Pittaway are intimately involved in intelligence matters with multiple agencies in Burma, in the Golden Triangle, and even later in Afghanistan, It all relates to the production of opium and intelligence and arms. And they're on the ground providing education, and this is the part that I would like you to have a look at. It's intelligence they're providing on the production of opium and this, the National Endowment for Democracy Foundation support. This is the foundation that Oliver North had set up, and with John Singlaub, Oliver North and Richard Sequel were using as a front to raise funds for the supply of arms for the Iran-Contra. And this is written by George Pittaway himself, confirming the cover letter and relevant documents would be forwarded the National Endowment for Democracy, an entity funded by Congress of the United States. A task force will then be assembled by NED and follow suitable venue to meet with the authors of the documents, etc. So they're providing all the literature and education of democracy direct in to assist the university and students for an uprising, the freedom fighters to be educated in order for them to support the uprising in the name of democracy. I will do a future podcast, but there is overwhelming evidence that the secret team had set up National Endowment for Democracy, the Council for National Policy. They were using AmeriCares with, the Council for National Policy chairman was Pat Robertson, which I have indicated in definitive links to PROMIS, and also drugs with Lebanon and support and funding for Iran-Contra with the secret team, linked back to the Pan Am 103 bombing. AmeriCare, headed by Peter Grace, head of the Knights of Malta, which was in the name of aid programs, hospitals and medical care, was used as a front by Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, John Singlaub and Oliver North as a front for financing arms and support and training for the Iran-Contra. Also the Mooney Foundation was used as a front, and of course the WACKENHUT Institute set up by John Singlaub. This has all the fingerprints of the secret team's strategy in Burma, linked back with George Pittaway and James Pittaway, who are unwilling to assist in a true investigation into the death of Danny CASOLARO, but rather supply the sole testimony that Danny CASOLARO had the symptoms of depression, and they firmly believed that Danny CASOLARO committed suicide, despite the fact that he had the most damaging evidence in his briefcase when he went to Martinsburg. A couple more documents, just so that you can follow this, is that Jim Pittaway, is confirming his involvement in Bangkok, and also the current dynamics of the Burmese resistance, also the Democratic Alliance of Burma. These are the front people for DIA, CIA infiltration, using those foundations that they're setting up in Virginia and sending the appropriate intelligence staff for psychological warfare, intelligence to head them up and run them in Burma. As you can see, this is authored by Jim Pittaway, who works for the CIA. Further evidence and documents. And this one here is a letter from George Pittaway and it's about the Burmese Jungle University. They're now setting up the support for the Burmese Jungle University and the training with NED for the indoctrination of students for an uprising. And the words just keep jumping out from George Pittaway: democratic system, democratic Burma, to aid the democratic forces in Burma, development of a moderate democratic youth, intelligentsia, and also being inspired by the democratic free market system, United States, and the uprising in Burma. He also provides intelligence back to government agencies, the intelligence of oil, which companies are in there, what they're doing, who's supporting them, the contracts being signed, the involvement of the military, the kickbacks, but more important, the worry that the people who can make the immediate decisions for the signing of the contracts may be thrown out of government in the future, and that we need to be lenient to keep them in power after any uprising, so that we have continuity with our agreements and control of oil supplies. So it really is about commercialism, trade, oil, arms, and of course there seems to be a flow of intelligence on the Golden Triangle drugs that the secret team seems to be able to deliver into New York and America and Australia, that avoids any drug interdiction program to finance arms to the Iran-Contra. And so a couple more there. And I'll skip through these. These are just to confirm, all from George Pittaway. And then finally, the final one is, I got this from the CIA database dated 1985, and here is James Pittaway, Danny's best friend, confirming his summary intelligence for them in an article and report, which is then being released, on what's going on in Afghanistan. And so it turns out that James Pittaway isn't just a do-gooder and close friend and willing to carry Danny's coffin out. He provided the nails that closed the investigation on Danny's coffin, kept him in there as depressed and committed suicide. Who needs friends when you've got James Pittaway to give this testimony that Zipperstein and Erskine are prepared to put into their final summation as definitive evidence? There were no threats against Danny CASOLARO. He had nothing in his files that were putting him in danger, and he was simply disillusioned and decided to commit suicide. It's far more sophisticated. This is a coordinated propaganda program to shut down and prevent a true independent investigation being done, to cover up the fact that these foundations have been selling drugs and arms worldwide since 1960s and 70s, and still continue possibly even to today. It is all about drugs, arms, terrorism, dictatorships, and making money. So summarising, yes, it's true. They're in Burma and they run a company called Burma Trade Council, but they're behind all the foundations that are fronts for intelligence and promoting democracy. Yes, they're intimately involved with the resistance fighters and standing with the box made in USA with arms. Yes, James Pittaway is a CIA agent, and therefore his testimony that he gave about Danny CASOLARO being depressed and committed suicide is null and void. And I believe the Department of Justice and FBI knew that. because they did not follow the evidence. They did not interview any of the witnesses that are coming up now and in the past who would have given credible testimony. And I'm going to go on to show you that Scott Erskine deliberately undermined the credibility of all credible witnesses when preparing his report. It's in his own handwriting, or the handwriting of whoever's interviewing. It is the most damaging things that you can write to undermine the credibility of witnesses, and also changing the testimonies to suit that this will be the conclusion from the beginning. It was always planned that the evidence would be that Danny was financially broke, failing in life, disconnected from reality, depressed, and went down to Martinsburg to commit suicide. And it's a lie. So let's look at the key person that James Pittaway was working with, and who is he, and how does he fit into the secret team, and also how does he link back to the financing of Beau Gritz and Lance Trimmer for their operations. And in my next part of the podcast, I will prove to you that I have traced the funds back to General Richard Stilwell and Patrick Moriarty, who was the business partner of Michael Riconosciuto's father, Marshall Riconosciuto. And I will prove to you that the evidence is overwhelming that all drug cases and murders relating to Iran-Contra secret team drugs and arms to Iran-Contra and the murders that occurred of Paul Maraska at Cabazon, who was laundering the funds for CIA through Nugan Hand Bank for Michael Hand, involves the same attorney involved in everything, that brings to light that there was a deliberate withholding of key legal evidence. In fact, CIA raided police locker evidence to remove the evidence that ties this all together. And that is why Danny CASOLARO was calling Lance Trimmer and Beau Gritz. And hence why I called Lance Trimmer to get his perception, but also the evidence that he provides me as well. It links back to Nugan Hand Bank, Golden Triangle, with William Colby, William Casey, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, and also, you're going to love it, Richard Armitage and General Richard G. Stilwell. And here we go. During my interview with Dee Ferdinand about her father, she had received a visit from the RCMP, who were investigating the theft of the PROMIS software, that it was sold to the RCMP and CSIS, the intelligence agency, and used for laundering Nugan Hand Bank's funds and drugs through the Imperial Bank of Canada and the Royal Bank of Canada. That's why they went to see her. They had visited her because they had first gone to see Michael Riconosciuto about the PROMIS software. And then they went immediately to interview and get evidence of the accounts held by her father, Colonel Albert V. Carone, who was the bagman for the CIA and the interface with the Gambino Mafia, with the Nugan Hand Bank. And just to remind you, in my interview, she reconfirmed Robert Mayhew arranged for her to meet directly with Ted Shackley. Her father had died. She had no money. All her bank accounts had been shut down, or records just destroyed and went missing as soon as her father died. And she couldn't afford
a funeral and a tombstone for her father. So she was reaching out. And so she had bumped into Robert Mayhew, who arranged for her to meet directly with Ted Shackley. So here's the link of Ted Shackley on the scene. Ted Shackley confirmed to her that he personally knew her father. He offered and did pay for the tombstone that you can see above for her father. There's the letter confirming that Ted Shackley's girlfriend met with George Pittaway and Danny, handwritten in the investigation reports by the Detective George Schwartzwood, who's investigating evidence that Danny CASOLARO had either been murdered or committed suicide. Also, confirmation, as I say, that there's a girlfriend. They have a name and number, and Martinsburg police don't contact her, and neither does the Zipperstein and Erskine investigation contact her, given her telephone numbers there. She also confirmed that when she was suing the CIA, she received a telephone call from Richard Armitage warning her to remain silent about all matters involving her father. She confirms categorically that Frank Nugan and Michael Hand knew her father. They were good friends. Nugan Hand Bank, it was the bank used in Hong Kong area to launder different monies. There was General Leroy Manor. And then she says, General Stillwell was involved. And a man named Paul Halliwell was involved. Now, General Stillwell is the photograph above is General Richard G. Stillwell, who is working with James Ridgway. So there's your link. James Ridgway works for CIA and he personally knows Richard G. Stillwell, who is involved in financing Beau Gritz and Lance Trimmer's first operation to go in to recover any POWs or MIAs, and more important, is directly linked to the Nugan Hand Bank with Ted Shackley and Richard Secord. And she says it was an operation where drug monies in different accounts from certain people were absconded with. One through Nugan Hand Bank, and they were used for operations that were not sanctioned by the US government, purely black operations. And the drug monies they used for cocaine trafficking. And then she says, well, my father knew Frank Nugan and Michael Hand, and I might get mixed up, but I think it was Michael Hand that he knew from like the Bronx area of New York. If I'm not mistaken, he was special forces or in the military at one time. Just to confirm, this is an article written by James Pittaway, confirming that he's working with, he knows General Richard G. Stillwell at Pentagon and has been working and providing intelligence on matters in Afghanistan to him. She also says that Donald Beasley used to call the house on her father's private line, also received Edwin Black and Nugan from Nugan Hand Bank telephone calls. Her father knew Rafael Quintero and called him Chi-Chi. Her father knew Harry Wainwright, Nugan Hand Bank. Paul Halliwell was very close to Michael Hand and Frank Nugan. There was some type of connection with Paul Halliwell, William Casey and her father. And as I said in my previous podcast, she says her father knew Mary S. Riley. Now, I never asked her about that. That's the testimony she gave in court, but reconfirms it. There are a few occasions that Mr. Riley had come to the house, but when he came to the house to discuss things. No one knows, but Murray S. Riley is an Australian police officer who is one of the biggest drug barons laundering drugs through Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. So there's the confirmation that no one else would recognise, but she knew him and he came to the house. And so if you go through all of this, this was in my podcast which found the definitive evidence of the link that the Gambino Mafia owned the Cabazon Casino with John P. Nichols, who is former CIA. It was also involved with WACKENHUT Cabazon Arms with Robert Booth Nichols' company, Meridian Arms, and Meridian Logistics International, which also was linked with the Gambino Mafia as directors. But more importantly, it was linked to the Recovery Technologies company that was owned by Paul Maraska and Michael Riconosciuto, and Michael has testified that Paul Maraska was the banker to assist the Nugan Bank to launder the funds out of Australia, and they were doing it through the Cabazon and Swiss accounts. So it turns out that his partner, Paul Maraska, was murdered, and it was over the fact of major transactions that relate to early 1978, 9 and 80 and 81, and he was murdered on January 1982. And I will show you in the next parts of the podcast that the attorney that's representing the person who is alleged to have murdered him was an employee of WACKENHUT and John P. Nichols and George WACKENHUT, and that attorney that's defending him is also the attorney in 1990 confirming that the CIA had raided the police evidence lockers to take all the evidence that links to the secret team's drugs and arms to Iran-Contra, and the parties who are linked and in Burma with Bo Gritz and Lance Trimmer. So as you can see, you can't make this up. It all is connected. In addition to the oversight of the Zipperstein and Erskine investigation, the fact is that Curtis Sam Cross, former chief of Indigo Police, investigated the multiple murders at Cabazon. He was never interviewed by the FBI, US Department of Justice, the Zipperstein, in their investigations. And why was it important? Well, he provided a letter of support and endorsement for the credibility of Michael Riconosciuto in his assistance with matters relating to murder at the Cabazon. But more important than this, because he says this in his interview to me, because when I was back in Washington, Danny CASOLARO made contact with me. Actually, I shouldn't say with me. It's with an author who I was working with early, Gordon Savell. But this is what he's saying. Because when I was back in Washington, Danny CASOLARO made contact with me and talked on the phone, and we had made an appointment. My wife and I were going to have dinner with him on Saturday night, and he turned up dead in a hotel in Virginia. You know, the whole thing with his death didn't sit well with a lot of people. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. I also do believe that Danny CASOLARO was murdered. I agree. Anyone that knew Michael Riconosciuto ended up dead. Now, that's not a reflection on Michael Riconosciuto. It's the people around him were highly dangerous. The prosecuting attorney of Dr. Nichols and myself were contacted by the FBI and told there was a contract out on us. He says that a friend of mine who is an FBI agent, he contacted me personally by phone in Boston, D.C. and told me about it. He wasn't contacted officially by FBI. It just happens that a friend of his had come across the intelligence within FBI. And I had known him for a long time. And he's a jokester, and I said, come on, you're pulling my leg. And he said, no, I'm very serious. Well, I still kept a good eye out, and that guy that had the contract on me is still in prison. The person that had the contract on me, his moniker was Jason. His AKA was Jason. This part's very important. In the next parts of the podcast, I will prove to you that the person that had murdered Paul Maraska, that was Michael Riconosciuto's partner, business partner, who was assisting the Nugan Bank to move the money out of Australia through the Cabazon Casino and through the banks in Switzerland and the USA. was Philip Arthur Thompson, who was employed by George WACKENHUT and Dr. John P. Phillips. This is very interesting, and it will highlight the connections back. So it turns out that he was arrested and was out of prison at the time, and he'd been charged with 3 life sentences for murder and multiple rapes and kidnapping and arms offences, and he's out of prison on his way to assassinate Sam Crossan, the attorney. He says the prosecuting attorney of Dr. Nichols was Richard Irwood, Indigo Deputy Attorney General. He's a judge now still working in Indigo. A young highway patrolman stopped him up for a bad tail light and found a quantity of C4 explosives. Now, remember my previous podcast? You can't get your hands on C4 explosives really easily, and Danny Sheehan had uncovered that there was a ton of C4 explosives connected to Richard Secord and John Sinlow and Oliver North, with a company that was linked back to the Pan Am 103 bombing and operations by the secret team in Lebanon. And he says also some illegal weapons in his trunk. And they sent him to prison. It was pure fluke. The highway patrolman was fresh out of academy and didn't know who he was stopping. He then says, I've never heard anyone else say anything else about Danny Casolaro's briefcase. Isn't that interesting? Neither did Zepperstein, neither did Erskine in their investigations. But the way I was supposed to recognise him was that we were going to meet at a restaurant in Northern Virginia, and he said, I will have a small brown briefcase sitting by my chair. Over the years, governments, most of them are on a feeding frenzy, where they get to a point where certain segments of the governments feel that the means justifies the end, and they can do whatever they want. And I'm sure that happens a lot. We are supposed to be a law-abiding country, God-fearing and founded on the principles of the Bible and so forth. But I learned a long time ago that governments, no matter where they are, all over the world, they are all the same. I think it will continue, and it will continue, only get worse. That is a beautiful summary of the evidence so far on the Zepperstein, Erskine investigation into the death of Danny Casolaro and the pseudo-fabricated evidence that was provided by a CIA agent to have the final report conclude that Danny was depressed and committed suicide. So coming back to that evidence against, Peter Zakowski provided a manuscript written by Robert Booth Nichols himself. He already identified that Jim Pittaway and George Pittaway were both worked closely with DIA, and they were currently with the Burmese Trade Council. So the evidence was already out there. It was knowledge known. So the evidence of the secret team has confirmed the links of Ted Shackley with Frank Colucci, Robert Booth Nichols, to bring down the democratically elected government of Australia, involving Michael Hand and the Nugan Hand Bank. The evidence that I've covered in previous podcasts is that confirms that the secret team with Ted Shackley, William Casey, Frank Colucci, Robert Gray, George Bush Sr. and George Pender had infiltrated all the intelligence databases on drug intelligence, CIA, NSA, defense, justice, so that they were able to undermine the intelligence computer systems and radar tracking systems for the interdiction program. And so this part will now end, which is summarising the evidence relating to the Pittaway brothers as the source of evidence for the conclusions drawn by the Zepperstein report and the fabrication of evidence that Danny Casolaro was depressed and committed suicide, given that the source of the information was CIA itself. And just to reconfirm, the source is attending a meeting with CIA with Frank Colucci, Ray Klein, and also William Colby, and he himself belongs to the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. And so the evidence, summarising, is the Pittaway brothers are involved with DIA and CIA and are using the National Endowment for Democracy that Oliver North, Richard Secord and John Singlaub and Ted Shackley have been using to raise funds for the sale of drugs and the sale of arms to the Iran-Contra. And it's active in its operations in Burma with the Pittaway brothers. And there's the summary again, that the report was based on the testimony of Jim Pittaway to provide that damaging evidence and professional profiling of his best friend Danny CASOLARO. And as I said, he was carrying out the coffin of Danny CASOLARO whilst driving the nails into his coffin to keep it shut, to provide the damning evidence, the most damaging evidence that concluded that Danny was depressed and committed suicide, fed by CIA. And this is wonderful. There's the evidence of their investigation, realizing that they're going too far because it's contradictory evidence. 1 minute the Ridgways are telling us that he's a drunk and he's drunk all the time, and claiming that Windy Weaver's saying he's drunk at least 3 times a week, when it wasn't true. And it was contradicting the family and his best friends that said that he didn't have a drinking problem. Almost uniformly they said that he wasn't a heavy drinker, and he certainly was an alcoholic. So you can see how they're fabricating the evidence to substantiate the evidence and profiling provided by the CIA to close his coffin.